About 90% of technology startups funded by investors fail. No one wants to fail, not founders, certainly not investors. Investors are hunting for a unicorn, 1 billion value companies, and 10x returns on investment from a startup. On the other hand, startup founders are, especially first-time entrepreneurs, are not just looking for funding from investors, but also advisors and connections. So how do we create win-win situation for both startups and investors? Let's find out. I am Sanjeev Tanna, producer and host for today's show. Dr. Michael Weickert is president at Weickert Partners. Michael is an entrepreneur, investor, scientist, innovator, and advisor to many startups. Michael has extensive experience in leading businesses, startups in drug delivery, biotechnology, medical devices, pharmaceutical industry. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, past 20 years, if you ask me, it's the golden period for founders and investors. If I have a good idea, I go online, Kickstarter, or any crowdsourcing, I can raise the funding. Or I can go to any accelerator or incubators. Big companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they have their own startup culture. Within the company, they are funding some of their employees, or maybe outsider, I don't know. So, and then of course for investors, it's not that if I want to invest outside USA, or let's say some Chinese companies or Chinese investor wants to invest in USA, it's straightforward. It's easy. There's a company called Angel.co. You can become investor and then on startups. So with so much data, so much noise, I mean, I would like to call it noise because there are so many people are involved in startups and investing business. How do you align interests for startups and investors?
So first out, I think you point out that there's a tremendous ecosystem that's been built over the last several decades. And that ecosystem includes a critical mass of ideas, entrepreneurs, talent, and investors, and capital. So that critical mass has created, you know, as I think the other way of describing what you just described, almost a feeding frenzy of capital chasing ideas. Now, some of that's in the medical field, and that's what I really specialize in.
Yes.
So I can't really talk to a lot of the tech investing, because I think tech investing has become really explosive in the last 2 decades. And a lot of things you talk about, like Kickstarter, are really for tech-type investments. They don't really apply to medical investments because medical investments take so much capital, so much skill, and so much time to ripen that those investors, are the investors that are going to kick into a Kickstarter campaign are not the investors that you seek.
No, I understand. But in medical devices also, there was a time, I don't know what time, but you have been in medical device industry more than I am. But there was a time when you have prototype and you can get funding. But now, it's hard to get funding, right? I mean, you have to go through, you have to go through clinical trials, you have to show your prototypes, and then company will invest in the money. So there's a lot of have been changed for the last few years, but still it's easy access money compared to what it used to be, right? I mean, you have raised many have raised money for many startups, right?
Yeah, I've raised everything from seed funding, friends and family rounds through Series C. So yes, I've raised lots of strategic money as well, which is one of the ways that people have started to mitigate the fact that there's been a drain of early stage investment money. So there's been obviously a change over the last couple decades in the way in which this ecosystem is operated. Venture capital has become more risk averse, which means that the same requirements for registering a medical device or a therapeutic or a biotherapeutic exist that existed 2 decades ago. So the same time and data requirements still existed then as existed now. What's changed is that a lot of the venture capital, which is your risk capital, has become risk averse, especially after events like 2008. When a lot of risk investors were seriously damaged, if not destroyed. And so risk capital moved to growth capital. And the risk capital pool that used to nurture and fund the early stage investments has taken a big hit. And what's come in to replace that is angels, family offices, and strategic investors. I mean, there's certainly still some investment funds that are venture investors that are interested in the early stage investments. But there's also a lot of others that have come in to try to take their place and to nurture those investments. Now, Silicon Valley is a very privileged place.
It is.
Okay. In Silicon Valley, you have the critical mass of ideas because you have so many great academic institutions here. Right. You have the critical mass of talent because there's people who've worked at different companies here that reside here that have expertise in all the different attributes you need for a life sciences company. Right. And you also have the critical mass of capital. Right. You know, there's no better place to secure investment capital than Silicon Valley. Right. So that gives us a real privileged position. All around the rest of the country, it's much more difficult to come by the combination. Right. There are lots of institutions that have great ideas, but getting enough talent and capital to take those ideas to fruition, take them to commercialization is extremely difficult to secure.
Tell me about your company, Weickert Partners.
Sure.
You provide advisory services to the startup founders or startup companies, and then some well-established companies also. What exactly your role here at Weickert Partners?
Well, my role is generally about business strategy. Generally, entrepreneurs and startup company founders have great ideas. Right. They have a great technology. Right. What they often lack, especially if it's their first time, is they lack the understanding of how to translate that technology vision into actual products and how to make sure those products meet medical needs in the healthcare ecosystem such that they would be commercial successes.
So you give a good representations. Their idea, they may not know how to put down on a real, how to implement or execute. You just help them in executing or implementing their idea into reality.
Well, I do two things for them. One is to actually help them understand what's required to develop products out of the technology idea, or to help them understand what the products are going to be from the technology, what the look, feel, and how those products will fit into the clinical practice that they're intended to support. Because there's a lot more to being successful with a medical idea than just making a device. The device has to be reimbursed. The device has to be approved. The device has to fit the workflow of that particular practice where it's going to be helping patients. It has to be usable with the other things that support those patients. And all of that is a little more complicated than I think most people appreciate when they first approach it as, oh, I've got this great solution. This is going to change everything. Well, the problem is when you change everything, then you also increase the barriers and the resistance. Because everything you change is something that people aren't going to want to change because they're used to the way they do it now. So the more you can fit into the flow of medicine as is practiced now, but offer something that fits that flow but with dramatic improvements in patient care or patient outcomes, the more successful that's going to be. And if you can tell that story compellingly to investors, then obviously the more successful you're going to be in raising the necessary capital. So it's first lay the business foundation, and once you have that very sensible, logical, well-grounded business foundation, tell the story of that to investors, to partners, to clinicians, to get them all enrolled in moving that business forward and making it successful. So that's what the core of what I try to provide for companies is.
Right. So for starting up a medical device, we just now talk, it's compared to technology. I mean, it's a software company. It's one thing. It's easy to get funding. And then you have startup in medical devices, and in medical devices, investors go through all the due diligence. There is a company in Silicon Valley, Theranos, just now. You know what happened, right? I mean, it was,
of course. It's everybody's horror story of what can happen with hundreds of millions of dollars invested. A complete lack of transparency, and a failure to actually deliver the results that were promised.
But see, what concerns me, I know it's off the subject, but the investors, they are professionals. I mean, they know what they're doing. They have done their due diligence. So I'm surprised that investor did not do enough due diligence in this
Well, there's
case,
a lot of investors in Silicon Valley that are also surprised. Because a lot of the medical investors in Silicon Valley did not participate in Theranos through the rounds.
Exactly.
And remained skeptical through a lot of the promises that were delivered. And the absence of evidence that they were delivering on their milestones has come back to sort of haunt the investors and validate those that chose not to invest after having done diligence. So, no investor hits all the unicorns, and no investor, misses all the goats.
Right.
And so, obviously, you do the best you can with the knowledge you have, and you make a judgment. And a lot of times you get the judgment wrong, and investors know that. They know that they're going to put money into things that aren't going to work. When you see a spectacular failure like this, there's a tendency to want to sort of judge that, somehow there's been a bit of a herd mentality, or people were dazzled with the board that was not actually medical professionals. It was a board of luminaries, but not luminaries who would have any particular experience in this space. Right. And there may be something to that. There may be people who were impressed by the people that have been brought on the board. Right. But it's a mistake. Yeah. The investors invested in a dream, and the dream didn't get fulfilled. Yeah. And there's part of that that's like, okay, the diligence on the original investment, was it good enough? But there's also part of it that's like, did the company execute and fulfill its promise? Exactly. And there's also sometimes, people have great ideas and great vision, but it doesn't work. They try to make it work, they do their best, and it just doesn't work out.
You recently wrote a blog on finding diamonds in rough. I mean, I went through that. It's a fantastic blog. Tell our viewers what exactly it's about, and how it can help startup founders, especially first-time founders.
Sure. So diamonds in the rough is what I've taken to calling the great ideas that are really going to substantially change medical practice and produce outstanding new results for patients in different conditions, but they're coming from a source that's outside the mainstream. So if you're Bob Langer at MIT, every idea your lab has is going to get funded. Right. Okay, no problem. Right. Okay, if you're coming out of Stanford, there's 50 different incubators at Stanford that can help you get your company out and support it and get it funded. Okay, but if you're coming from somewhere in the Midwest, if you're coming from the University of Madison, or you're coming from Austin, Texas, or you're coming from a private medical practice that isn't in a major institution, and you're not part of the thought leadership of that particular space that you're developing an innovation for, then it's going to be very difficult for your idea to break through and get attention. You're not going to get published in the journals because the editors don't believe what you have to say. You're not going to get grants because the same people that are the thought leaders are also participating in the grant review process at NIH. So this is not a likely prospect for funding the company. And then those are the same people that investors are going to call on to say, hey, what do you think about this idea? And they're going to go, oh, that idea is crazy. We know it's this. Even if this is something that is not successfully supporting patients. A good example of stuff not breaking through is, most people know about the Australian physicians who discovered Helicobacter pylori caused gastric ulcers. So that was a discovery in the 80s. It got the Nobel Prize in 2004. And this was a major advance in medicine, because up till then we thought it was stress, diet, lifestyle. Gastric ulcers were a lifetime issue. You would manage it with certain drugs and certain changes to your behavior. And then it became something you could cure in a 3-week course of antibiotics because of their discovery. But most people don't know that in the 50s and 60s, a Greek physician named John Weickert cured 30,000 Greeks of their gastric ulcers using antibiotics. Right. He tried to publish that work in the Journal of the American Medical Association, but they rejected his paper. And then, to add insult to injury, the Greek medical authorities fined him for malpractice. So it's a perfect example of, we already had the solution in the 50s and 60s, but we failed to recognize it and incorporate it into medicine. And so this is one of the challenges with diamonds in the rough. Good ideas that don't get the attention. How can I support and create the ecosystem that those ideas start getting what they deserve?
Michael, this is a fantastic talk. I'm afraid we had to end here. But thanks for coming down to our show. And for our viewers, please keep watching ST Well Affair, and see you next time.